The Kìltem Massacre. 84 years ago, a tragedy occurred on the small Scottish island of Kìltem. This event, which became known as the Kìltem Massacre, is still shrouded in mystery. This is what we know. 116 islanders were slaughtered on the night of the 17th to the 18th of March, 1924. The women dressed their children in their Sunday best and then strangled them with neckties. They read them a bedtime story and then suffocated them in their sleep with pillows or stabbed them with kitchen knives. They drowned them in bathtubs, threw them down wells or off cliffs, whichever was closer. The killing spree was merciless. Among the rocks, washed up by the sea, pets were found alongside the corpses of children, dogs and cats, even a sheep. After disposing of their offspring, the parents threw themselves upon each other. The one that was left either committed suicide or went off to kill his neighbours.
Only one person survived the horrific night, 16-year-old Anita McCafferty. On that fateful evening, she went to visit a friend on the other side of the island. She stayed longer than she was allowed to, and it was that tardiness that saved her life.
She knew she was in for a thrashing. She trudged back along the shoreline that was being battered by the dark night sea. She testified that she reached the stone wall on the edge of their plot and stopped there.
It was not fear of the cane that caused her to hesitate, she said, but some kind of premonition.
When the investigators asked her about the origin of the evil premonition, she couldn't describe it to them. In any case, the premonition was the second thing that saved her life. She didn't enter the house through the door as she would normally have. She first peeped through the window. What she saw took her breath away. Her mother was lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Her father was bending over her, a long butcher's knife in his hand. Anita didn't cry out, and that was probably the third thing that saved her life. She just moved away from the window in shock and stumbled into the barn. Then, hiding under the hay, she watched through a crack between the boards as her father took her younger siblings, a 5-year-old sister and 7-year-old brother, in his arms and walked them to the cliff. Anita buried her face in the hay. With her hands pressed tightly to her ears, she listened as her father searched for her, calling, wheedling, and threatening. Finally, his voice was lost in the darkness. 16-year-old Anita spent the night in the barn. She could hear the sounds of women being killed and children wailing, the crazed shrieks of their killers. She didn't venture out of the barn until morning. The sun beat down on the wet grass she stepped into. The crashing of the waves at the bottom of the cliff was muffled and regular. The night storm was over. It had been one of the few nice mornings on the island, which lies under a shroud of fog or a veil of rain for most of the year. For Anita, though, it was the most horrific morning she'd ever known. The dead bodies of villagers were strewn over the lush green sward, slashed, stabbed, some torn apart as though feasted on by wolves. The quantity and nature of the injuries shocked Anita. They showed that the murderer's motivation was not just killing, but revenge. It defied common sense. These were their families, neighbours, friends, and in the space of one night, they all wiped each other out like gladiators in the Colosseum. Not a soul was left alive on the island, except Anita and the sheep grazing on the hillsides. Anita untied a boat and set off for the mainland. She never returned to the island, not even when the police asked her to help with the investigation. She was placed with a foster family in Fort William, where she spent 5 years. She ran away at 21, whereupon she vanished from the face of the earth. And Jack learned all this too late, that is, after he had bought a house on the island. A low stone building with 2 chimneys and a black slate roof.
The farm came with a small stone-fenced plot and a crumbling barn.
The interior consisted of a narrow hall, 2 small rooms and a low attic. Jack couldn't believe that a married couple and 3 children had fitted into this small box 84 years ago. Now, in 2008, he felt like a sardine in a can himself. Jack was a proud Scot and loved the Scottish countryside. His family came from Inverness, a town which, along with the Caledonian Canal, formed the boundary between the more densely populated southern part of Scotland and the rugged, emptier north. It was the north that was closer to Jack's heart. He loved those glacier-smoothed hills stretching into the distance. A land as rugged and yet as smooth as the local whisky, with its deep dramatic glens and limpid lochs like healed scars from sword cuts. Jack was born in Scotland and knew he would die here. He was the youngest of 6 siblings, and like all his brothers and sisters, he had headed south after passing his standard grade. He moved to Glasgow, where he studied social sciences and worked for several years in the city's Catholic Charity Centre. He had always longed for 2 things: a big family and a small village in the north to live in. There was only one thing keeping him in Glasgow, Scotland's most populous city: the belief that it would be easier to find a suitable partner there, a lass he could then take back to his beloved Highlands. But in 2008, the economic crisis hit. Jack lost his job and realised he could forget about starting a family. He was desperately scanning the classifieds when he came across a job offer at a hospice in Mallaig. He knew Mallaig. It was a small harbour town roughly at the opposite end of the Scottish mainland to his native Inverness. He was counting on finding a cheap place to stay in one of the local hostels or a bed and breakfast. He bought a house instead. Of course, he was flabbergasted by the price, incredibly low, even considering it was a house on the island. But to avoid jinxing it, he decided not to query the estate agent about the price. All he needed was to see it. The cottage was fine, livable and perfectly suited to his needs. A ferry came to the pier twice a day, and it took half an hour to reach the mainland. In another 10 minutes, he would be at the hospice. Having been assured that he could schedule his working hours around the ferry timetable, he had no reason to hesitate. Now he could have kicked himself for not doing any research. There were so many warning signs, not just the price, but the fact that the house hadn't been occupied for 84 years. Just as most of the other houses on the island weren't occupied. The first record of a settlement of Kìltem dated from 1595. In its heyday, it had 300 inhabitants. Now, barely 20. The island resembled an open-air museum where history had stopped at some point, preserved like an insect in resin. You could count the number of houses whose windows were lit up after dark on the fingers of one hand. There were no old people living here and not a single descendant of the original settlers. Only modern incomers. All indications were that some tragedy had befallen this corner of the earth at the beginning of the last century. If Jack hadn't known it was nonsense, he would have thought a tsunami had swept over the island, or a plague. But the reasons need not have been catastrophic at all, he assured himself. For example, a simple migration caused by economic crisis could have been to blame. After all, he too had been forced to weigh anchor and leave Glasgow as a result of recession a century later. He remembered his school lessons where they had learnt about the Highland clearances when thousands of people had to leave the Scottish hills. From the nearby island of Rome, all 450 inhabitants had gone to Nova Scotia in Canada in 1825. All 150 inhabitants left the Isle of Muck. And confirmation that the outlying parts of Scotland are depopulating as part of a natural demographic trend is illustrated by the fate of one of Europe's most remote islands, St. Kilda. People lived on this piece of rock since the Bronze Age, until the 1930s, when all the remaining people left of their own volition. It's all right, Jack reassured himself, but it wasn't, and his first evening walk made it clear. Crosses, dozens of crosses, hundreds of crosses. The grassy hillsides were studded with them like needles. Jack found that no matter where he stood on the island, he could see at least 3. What's more, the carved ornaments and inscriptions, whose sharp edges had not yet been smoothed down by the daily rain or wind, told him they weren't old. Certainly not more than 100 years old. It was a mystery until his first day of work. That Monday morning, Jack met Ellie. Ellie was his nearest neighbour, a pretty young girl with curly red hair and a backpack in which she carried her laptop. She worked in the harbour master's office in the port of Malig. Like Jack, she had recently come to the island, 2 years ago. "They all killed each other," said Jack, his mouth agape. The morning ferry was breasting the waves with loud booms as it slogged towards the mainland. "All except one girl," Ellie confirmed. Jack was speechless. "There are lots of articles about it on the internet," Ellie said. She reached for her backpack and started to pull out her laptop. "I didn't read any," Jack admitted. Ellie typed Kìltem Massacre into the search engine and clicked on the images tag. The photos that appeared in front of Jack were black and white and poor quality. They were horrifying nonetheless. Dead people with their heads cut off and knives stuck in them. Lying on beds, floors, doorsteps, some with a noose around their necks, swinging inches off the ground. "Why?" "Nobody knows. People here are very superstitious. They think it was the devil himself who was behind it." "That's why there are all these crosses," Jack gasped. Ellie nodded. "I guess they're meant to protect the island from the return of the dark forces." Jack was shocked. He immediately understood why his house was so suspiciously cheap. 84 years ago, it had been a murder scene, like all the other houses. As Jack stepped off the boat onto the concrete quay in Malig that misty morning, his mind was made up. He would not return to Kìltem. He would call the estate agent, sell the house at a loss, and find some sort of rented accommodation. His work convinced him that was the right decision. The hospice he walked into that day was a grey, depressing place full of despair and lamentation. A station where the terminally ill waited hopefully for the train called death. When he left the hospice that afternoon, he felt old. He considered moving not only off the island, but away from Malig altogether, back to Glasgow. He walked the streets looking for a spare room or at least a bed. He traipsed from one B&B to another, but no vacancy signs looked down on him from all the doors. It's the holiday season, he thought, sitting down on a bench and letting the rain fall on him. He realised that the bus station was the only place he could find shelter, but it closed at midnight. In the evening, soaking wet, he trudged back to the harbour. Ellie was waiting for him. In the boat's cabin, she bought him some tea, fortified with whiskey, to warm him up and told him how 2 years ago she too had wondered whether she would find the courage to live on the island. "I haven't seen any ghosts there yet," she ended her speech cheerfully. "Anyway, how was your first day at work?" Jack sipped his hot toddy morosely. "Wonderful." In the end, Ellie persuaded Jack to change into dry clothes at home and drop around to her cottage. She welcomed him with cheddar and scotch. They talked for a long time, and Jack still couldn't believe that the island's past didn't bother her. "Someone died everywhere," Ellie stated, "and I needed a cheap place to live, and solitude." "There's plenty of that here," Jack nodded toward the darkness outside the window. Then he sighed. "Do you know how they died?" "Who?" "The people in your house." "Rachel Rawlins stabbed her husband Bill to death in the bedroom, then the children upstairs, and finally slit her own throat here at the kitchen table." Jack unconsciously withdrew his hands from the piece of furniture in question. Ellie laughed. "Not this kitchen table. Do you think I'd keep a relic like that here? The furniture is new."
"I," stammered Jack, a chill running down his back.
"I didn't change the furniture. Just the mattresses on the beds and... my God." "Relax. Your family didn't die in the house," Ellie said. "What?" I read that your predecessor, Farmer Brendan O'Neill, chased his wife into the barn and stabbed her with a pitchfork. Then he dragged the children to a cliff where he threw them into the sea. When he'd finished, he went back to the barn, stuck the handle of his pitchfork into the ground and pierced his throat with it 4 times.
That makes me feel a lot better, Jack quipped. He thought of the half-collapsed barn behind his house and was glad he hadn't set foot in it yet. He knew with complete certainty that that's how it was going to stay, and he knew for sure that he wouldn't pick up a pitchfork for the rest of his life.
Where did you learn all this? On the internet, Ellie said. You can find everything there.
The bastard, Jack muttered.
Who?
The estate agent. He didn't say anything about it.
And you wonder? The houses on the island are practically unsellable, even at half the price.
When Jack left Ellie that night, Ellie insisted on walking him home. The sea below the cliffs murmured mysteriously. The cliffs were a dark blue.
Aren't you afraid? Jack asked her, his gaze lingering on the distant lonely light in the window of Ellie's house. Anyone who chooses to live in a place like this can't be afraid, Ellie replied.
Jack reckoned she was right. So ended his first day on the island of Kìltem.
Many more days passed, almost a month in fact, and Jack was still in 2 minds whether to leave the island. He wasn't easy about living in the place of the tragic events, but apart from that he loved Kìltem Island. It fulfilled all his dreams of a place to live. It was quiet, without the city's chaos and honking cars, with breathtaking scenery and fresh sea winds. A dream home, except for its past. No matter how hard Jack tried, he couldn't get over it. He couldn't, like Ellie, just shut the door on its past and throw away the key. Jack knew that mysteries were a problem in his life. They actually pissed him off. He realized that whenever he encountered a mystery, he preferred to look away. And suddenly, he was in a situation where he couldn't. Do you want to live on Kìltem? Then you have to embrace mystery in your life. Jack was trying doggedly to overcome himself, but he found that he couldn't. And so he decided to solve this damn mystery known as the Kìltem Massacre. He was convinced that if he could find a logical explanation, he would stop feeling the urge to leave the island. Like a bloodhound tracking a wounded rabbit, he scoured the archives of the local library, brochures, studies, publications. When this was done, he went to Fort William, where the local newspaper promised him access to its back issues database. Jack flipped through the yellowing pages of the Fort William Courier, reading articles, looking at photographs. At the council office in Malig, the archivist placed a thick, dusty binder in front of him, devoted entirely to the Kìltem Massacre. Everyone covered it. The London press, American and French newspapers. As it turns out, in 1924, an event from a small Scottish island you wouldn't find on a map had swept the world. When Jack had all the newspaper clippings read and copied, he asked the chronicler if there was any way to learn more about the residents who had died at Kìltem. With a knowing smile, the chronicler left him for a moment. Then he laid out an absolute treasure trove in front of him. A list of names with years of birth and occupations of all 117 settlers. It turned out that most of them were farmers, sheep breeders and fishermen.
Then there were the landlord of the local pub, the Mottled Sheep, a doctor, a teacher and the owner of the small boat that connected Kìltem to the mainland.
He was called Harry. The name stuck in Jack's mind immediately, as he was the only one on the island who had no family and lived alone. With the help of surviving photographs taken between 1918 and 1924, Jack gradually pieced together a picture of the entire village. The most valuable photograph was the one taken in July 1923, the year before the tragedy. Marking the occasion of the annual sheep shearing, the photograph captured all the islanders. Jack gradually put a name to each face. The people who turned into mass murderers a few months later were given faces. "You're not trying to solve the mystery, are you?"
Ellie asked Jack one evening when she dropped in for tea.
She stared in amazement at the images plastering the walls. "Yep." "Why?" Jack shrugged. "Those who do not understand their past are doomed to repeat it." "You're scaring me," Ellie shuddered. "But nothing makes you afraid." Ellie shook her head. "Not nothing." After tea, they went for a walk. Seagulls glided along the cliffs and bobbed on the waves. Puffins, like penguins crossed with toucans, awkwardly stepped along the cliff edges like tightrope walkers over a precipice. Jack and Ellie watched the sunset. Jack was thinking that it was probably the most beautiful sunset to be seen anywhere in the world at this moment, and quite possibly the most beautiful sunset ever. "Tell me the truth," Ellie spoke suddenly. "Why are you doing this?" Jack sighed. "Some kind of obsession, I reckon. I just hate mysteries, and I think if I can solve this one, I'll feel better." "You can't solve the Kìltem Massacre." "Why ever not?" frowned Jack. "Because no one could. The team of police investigators, mystery buffs." "The truth exists." "Yes, but time has washed away the evidence. You're not going to find anything new after 84 years. "What was the reason you came here in the first place?" Jack changed the subject. "To Kìltem? I already told you. I wanted to be alone." "Tell me the truth." Jack looked at her. "Just like I told you the truth." Ellie moved her backpack and laptop closer to her body. The wind from the sea ruffled her red curls. "I don't want to talk about my secret yet." Jack burst out laughing. "Oh Lord, another mystery." Ellie laughed too. Then she suddenly grew serious. "My boyfriend left me," she blurted out hastily. "He left because—" Her voice broke. "You don't have to tell me, Ellie. Hey." Ellie was crying on Jack's shoulder, and he was holding her in his arms. All that was left of the sun was a golden furrow in the waves. The temperature had dropped. "Promise you'll stop your research as soon as you feel better." "I won't get better until I succeed," said Jack. He paused. "Do you really not care one bit about what happened that day?" "What do you think happened? They killed each other." "But why? Why did Rachel Rawlins grab a knife out one night of the blue and stab her husband 21 times in the room you go to sleep in every night, and then go upstairs to kill her children?" Ellie smiled. The wind had already dried the tears from her freckled cheeks, but her lashes were still damp. "I don't go to sleep in that room every night. Tonight, for example, I definitely won't go to sleep there. I couldn't do it even if I left the light on. You have some strange methods of getting a girl to spend the night with you." Time passed. The friendship between Jack and Ellie developed into a relationship. Jack saw his neighbour every day. They spent their evenings together. But they still lived apart. Jack no longer made copies of newspaper articles and photographs, not because he'd given up his research. There was just nothing more to make copies of. But he still didn't feel comfortable. There was one thing in life that bothered him besides mysteries: an unfinished job. In short, once Jack had started something, he had to finish it.
And so he kept at it. Although he had a computer, he asked Ellie, who seemed to be unbeatable at tracking down information, if she would do an internet search.
Ellie agreed, and by the next morning she had wrung 200 articles out of her laptop. These writers were not bound by the reputation of any periodical, and they were therefore not adverse to more open speculation. Jack was most amused by an extended article whose author speculated that the islanders had become host to a certain parasitic species of aliens. The aliens had invaded their minds to learn more about the human race. When they finished their research, they programmed the brains of the inhabitants to self-destruct, to cover their tracks. But not all the theories were far out. The idea of mass ingestion of a hallucinogenic drug seemed at least partially plausible. or an outbreak of an unknown disease whose symptoms were disorientation and aggression. The new materials did not bring Jack any closer to his goal, but he felt more and more strongly that something had changed. He developed a relationship with the faces staring back at him from the black and white mirrors of the past. They were no longer anonymous objects being used to solve a mystery. They had become people. When thinking about the Kìltem Massacre, Jack let his imagination run wild, conjecturing, making up stories. What were these people like before the massacre? What were their interests, their desires? They were the last generation untouched by technology. They lived on an isolated island in a country experiencing a profound economic crisis, where hot water didn't run from the taps and the infant mortality rate was the highest in Europe. Maybe they knew about telephones, cars, and electricity, but they certainly didn't use them. They didn't even have penicillin, which their compatriot Alexander Fleming accidentally discovered 4 years later. They were eking out a living in the northwesternmost corner of Europe. On a piece of rock separated from the mainland for most of the year by rough seas and from America by thousands of miles of boundless ocean. They spoke Scottish Gaelic, a language that is almost non-existent today, and their only contact with civilization was the ferry, which in winter and bad weather didn't run for up to a month. Despite all the problems, they laughed and loved. They drank whiskey in the pub called the Mottled Sheep. They prayed every Sunday in the local chapel. They sent their children to school. Someone might get drunk, but there was never any trouble. It was natural that there was never murder or theft on the island. Any injuries that the local doctor had to deal with came from accidents, and locking the doors was considered unnecessary even if the family was heading off to the mainland for a week's work. And then one day they picked up knives and they all slaughtered each other like madmen.
Not all of them, Jack corrected himself. Anita McCafferty.
Covered with hay and hidden in the barn, she was the only survivor. Jack searched for photographs of Anita, a cute little girl with long tresses blowing in the wind, frowning into the lens as the sun shone in her eyes. Jack noticed that she had freckles on her cheeks. There was nothing refined about her. She was a girl who might not be starving, but rarely tasted sweets, who wasn't collapsing from exhaustion, yet never knew a day without work. He imagined how everything she'd experienced that night must have affected her, and maybe he suspected how. She never returned to the island. She ran away from her foster family at 21, whereupon she vanished from the face of the earth. Spring had passed. Jack sat in the kitchen, his collection in front of him, watching the rain outside the window. Liquid sunshine, he mused with a smile. You only get that in Scotland. He already knew enough about the Kìltem Massacre to write a book. Even so, he hadn't come any closer to solving it. He lowered his eyes to the table, and then he froze. The photograph of Sophie Gordon lying in a bloody puddle with an axe in her head. Sophie Gordon was the wife of the local vicar. It was he who decided that he would reward her for a lifetime of loyalty as though she were a log he wanted to make into kindling for the fireplace. Jack thought he knew the photograph by heart, but a new detail now struck him in the gut. The sigil of Baphomet. Jack knew why he hadn't noticed this satanic symbol before. It was in the far corner of the photograph. It was 2 or 3 meters away from the dead woman's body. That's why it was slightly blurred. It wasn't painted either. It was made from, Jack squinted, little balls of something, dried peas or maybe corn. Last but not least, most of it was covered by a torn curtain. Jack wasn't at all surprised it had escaped his notice amongst all the disarrayed furniture and broken plates. What's more, he wasn't surprised that it had escaped the attention of the investigators.
Noticing such an insignificant detail next to a corpse with an axe in its head was about as likely as noticing that a diver being eaten by a shark was wearing his wedding ring on his right hand instead of his left.
The occult ornament in which a goat's head could be set was nothing new to Jack. He became familiar with its form and meaning while writing a university paper on the world's biggest sex. He thought it would be a boring topic that he would have to struggle through. As with the Kìltem Massacre, though, the work turned into an interest bordering almost on obsession. He handed in the paper on time and got an A+ on it. He knew that the word Baphomet was etymologically composed of the Greek word baphe and metis, meaning baptism by fire. This idol was originally worshipped by the Templars. Later, the five-pointed star in a circle became an unmistakable sign of Satanism. He squinted at the lines of the pattern and considered the likelihood that they had arisen naturally, that the balls of peas or corn had simply lined up that way by chance when they fell. It would be about as much of a coincidence as solving a Rubik's Cube blindfolded, like firing an arrow without aiming but hitting the bullseye, like assigning the right name to an unknown group of people. No, Jack concluded, all these things are possible, but little balls scattered in a regular Baphomet sigil shape are not. The symbol must have been created on purpose, but who created it? A person or someone else? Is Kìltem Island really a gateway from another world, from which goat-headed people come out onto the surface of the earth to bring other innocent souls to their underground kingdom? He thought of the stone crosses covering the island. Then he remembered the chapel as well. The islanders were religious. And did the golden crosses around their necks and the communion wafers they swallowed before the Kìltem Massacre help them? Jack suddenly felt fear. He turned sharply. The white walls, the cupboard, the carpet, the door leading into the hallway. On the chest of drawers was a vase holding red decorative stones. A candle burned beside it. Was it his imagination, or had its flame just swayed slightly, as if someone had passed by? He stood up and headed for the chest of drawers. He put his hand into the decorative vase, scooped up a handful of stones, and scattered them across the carpet. Nothing. No satanic symbol. Or any other particular shape. Jack wondered why he'd done it. Because he needed to be sure. 3 seconds of complete silence passed in the house. Then someone banged on the door. Jack let out a soft yelp. With a trembling hand, he picked up the stones and put them back in the vase. Then he hurried over to the door. Ellie stood behind it. She was wearing a raincoat and her backpack and laptop underneath it. "May I come in?" "Of course." "You look scared," she remarked as she slipped off her raincoat. Jack forced himself to smile. "I'm not," he assured her. In the living room, he stoked the fireplace and opened a bottle of whiskey. They both sat for a long time staring into the flames. "Why are you here?" Jack asked. "I feel safe with you," Ellie replied. He hugged her. "You are, Ellie. You're safe with me." Life on the island went on. Jack and Ellie took the ferry every morning and returned every afternoon. Malik's crowded port was groaning under the peak tourist season, and every day Ellie came back tired from the harbour master's office. Jack too felt exhausted, even though the tourist season didn't affect him. He had worked in social services all his life, but never in a hospice. It was only now that he understood why the hospice was offering a vacancy and a salary comparable to what social workers in Glasgow made, even at a time of economic crisis. The work was soul-destroying. Bleak rooms full of long-term patients with little or no hope of getting better. Chronic pain, bed sores, nappies, no laughter, just lamentation. Jack told himself over and over again that death is a part of life and that the end of life is never pleasant. Even so, he knew he had to get out. So he applied to the local employment office and asked them to send him job offers. He also set about destroying his material about the Kìltem Massacre. He hadn't solved the mystery and knew the truth would remain hidden. He nevertheless felt a sense of relief. He had transformed the original boulder lying on his chest into a harmless pebble in his shoe, which, although he could feel it, could be lived with. He tore the photographs and name labels off the walls.
He was about to climb up into the attic and leave the horrible fare to the spiders and rats, but he stopped.
He was struck by one image. It was the group photograph taken on the 24th of July 1923 on the occasion of the annual sheep shearing. It showed all the inhabitants of the island. Jack recognized them all but one, that is. A young woman. He'd initially ignored her, thinking she was a hired hand from the mainland, or simply an acquaintance who came to help out that day. He took the woman to be a stranger who found herself on Kìltem that July afternoon by chance. She couldn't have been an islander because she wasn't in any of the earlier photographs. She wasn't listed in the census, and she didn't look like an islander. She was slender and strikingly beautiful. She had long, straight raven hair that framed a sharply chiseled face with prominent cheekbones. It occurred to Jack that the woman, maybe still a girl in fact, would be more at home on the catwalks of the present day, not the remote islands of the west coast of Scotland in the last century. She wore a flannel shirt that was too big for her and long linen trousers. She looked straight into the lens with eyes as piercing as two glowing coals. She didn't fit the setting or the time at all. She was completely different from the other women who were mostly fair-haired and stockier. And there was another difference. Jack was infuriated that he hadn't noticed the detail before. The woman had beads hanging from her neck and wrists. The other woman didn't have beaded bracelets, and, in fact, they weren't adorned with anything that could be considered finery. Only some had the requisite cross on a chain round their necks. He went through all the photos again, but as he expected, he couldn't find the unknown dark woman in any of them. She seemed like an apparition. An apparition we only glimpse out of the corner of our eye, so we're not sure if we've actually seen a ghost or if it was just a trick of the light. "Put it out of your mind," Jack whispered to himself. The woman was God knows who, and she was of no importance. She featured in the photo by accident for a very simple reason you'll never figure out. You'll just be wasting your time. You were determined to quit, so put the black and white picture in the bloody box and take the box to the attic. Jack was tempted to do it. He really was, but he didn't. Leaving a job unfinished, the woman obviously was important, and he was going to find out. So he immersed himself in new research. The unknown woman was not one of the official 117 residents. He assumed that she lived on the island for some time, though. She probably arrived sometime between the last census in March 1923 and the sheep shearing on the 24th of July 1923. Jack let his imagination run wild. She had evidently arrived unexpectedly. Some well-meaning islander had evidently let her stay with him. She evidently had no money, no papers, no family. But there was too much evidently in his reasoning. Jack needed facts. Speculative fantasies wouldn't get him anywhere. Well, yes, facts, he thought, but where to get them after 84 years? He'd reached a dead end sooner than he'd anticipated. And so, Jack did, after all, stuff the Kìltem Massacre into a box that day and carry it up to the attic. He couldn't sleep that night. He lay on his back staring at the ceiling. Against his will, he thought about the mystery. A sigil of Baphomet and an unknown black-haired woman. A sigil of Baphomet and an unknown black-haired woman. A sigil of Baphomet and an unknown black-haired woman. And then his eyes widened like a man who has found a treasure chest. Anita McCafferty! The only survivor, the only person who could clear the murky waters off his thoughts. Who could tell him about the unknown woman with beads and a satanic symbol? Anita McCafferty, who never came back to the island after the disaster and ran away from her foster parents as soon as she came of age. But she's dead now. But is she really? Jack thought with a jump. What if she isn't? What if she is still alive? He had always taken Anita's death for granted. The event, which left no survivors and which was only recalled by well-thumbed black and white photographs, seemed as distant as the Ice Age. But it slowly dawned on Jack that there was no confirmation of Anita's death. It just seemed logical. After all, it had been 84 years since the Kìltem Massacre. Anita was 16 years old at the time, and if she were still alive today, she'd be 100. Jack knew from his daily routine at the hospice that living to 100 wasn't impossible. And if Anita was still alive... The very next day, he typed her name into a database in the hospice's office. It didn't take 2 minutes. Anita McCafferty was indeed 100 years old and was currently living in an old people's home in Edinburgh. He called there the same day and asked for Anita's attending physician. Hello, this is Jack calling. I'm a social worker at the hospice in Malig. What can I do for you, Mr. Collin? Jack hadn't thought up a harmless lie. One of my patients is dying. He asked me if I could pass on a message to one of your patients in person. Who exactly? Anita McCafferty. There was silence in the receiver. I think that'll be okay, he heard at last. I will tell Miss McCafferty you're coming. When would that be? Tomorrow. How is she? Jack asked. Mentally fine, but physically, she has chronic arthritis. Tendinitis. She can hardly move, but she refuses painkillers. Diabetes, high blood pressure, and so on. Do you think... Hard to tell. A short pause. But it won't be long, that's for sure. Nobody heard anything about that girl for over 80 years. How on earth did you find out about her? Ellie seemed shocked to learn that evening what her friend had found out. Luck, Jack smiled. Besides, practically no one was looking for her. And why should they? The investigators had found out everything they could from her at the time, and the foster family she'd run away from at 21 didn't seem to care where she ended up. I'm not surprised that I found her. I'm surprised she's still alive. I'm going to see her tomorrow to ask her about the woman with the beads. Jeez, it's been more than 84 years. Even if she remembers some woman, what can she possibly tell you about her? That she liked to wear beads? I think the woman with the beads is the key to solving the mystery. Ellie laughed. The mystery of the Kìltem Massacre. Come off it. Jack remembered the sigil of Baphomet. There's something else I noticed. What? I'll keep that to myself for now. Ellie laughed again. You don't think I'm going to steal your thunder, do you, Sherlock? Jack and Ellie then searched the internet for records of Anita's life. Anita had trained as a psychiatrist at Edinburgh Medical School and practiced throughout her life. A doctor then, Ellie remarked admiringly. But psychiatry must have been an emerging field at the time. Maybe she was a pioneer, Jack mused. But I still don't think anything will come of the visit. Ellie shut down her laptop and lay down to sleep. Oh well, at least you'll get to see civilization. Good night. Jack also bade her good night, but made no comment on her words. He certainly didn't think his trip would prove fruitless. There was also a vague apprehension driving him on, an uneasy feeling that if he did not solve the mystery, he would die. A phrase he'd used to scare Ellie a year ago kept coming back to his mind. Those who do not understand the past are doomed to repeat it. Jack arrived at Edinburgh bus station at 10 in the morning. As soon as he left the station and stepped out into the street, he felt shock. People everywhere, striding along the pavements, sitting on benches, talking on phones, rustling newspapers, drinking coffee, whistling and shouting. For the first time in his life, he understood the meaning of the word agoraphobia. At last he reached the retirement home. Anita's attending physician was a corpulent, grizzled man whose beard and hair had been cut with an electric razor to the same length. He frowned over glasses that seemed to belong to a head one size smaller. He spoke about Anita through pursed lips. In the end, though, he led him to the door of her room. Anita was lying on the bed, and it was clear she was expecting Jack's arrival. "Hello, Mrs. McCafferty," Jack greeted. "My name is—"
"I know your name, and I know why you've come,"
Anita interrupted him.
"And it's not Mrs. McCafferty, it's Miss—"
"I'm sorry," Jack lowered his eyes. There was a chair pulled up to her bed, but he wasn't sure whether to use it.
"Sit down,"
Anita said to him. She had taken the initiative quite naturally. She radiated the confidence that comes from the lifelong habit of being master of the situation. Why did Jack think it would be the other way around? Because she was 100 years old and should be senile?
"What brings you to me?"
she started matter-of-factly.
"I don't know anyone in Malik, and as far as I know, none of my patients live there."
"We see patients from all over Scotland at the local hospice," Jack said, sounding rather unnecessarily defensive. "But you're right. The matter that brings me here today has nothing to do with any of my patients."
"What is it then?"
Jack looked at Anita carefully. She was old with lots of wrinkles and liver spots, but at the same time clean and spruce. She had earrings in her ears, and she was even wearing makeup. Blusher on her cheeks, eyeshadow, and lips the colour of raspberries. Her chronic arthritis popped into Jack's mind, and he wondered how much pain it must have cost her to apply those few cosmetic details. Despite her age, Anita seemed sharp and focused. Her eyes didn't even remotely resemble those cold embers of Jack's hospice patients. She exuded personal charm and affability. "I'm here in connection with the Kìltem Massacre." A shadow passed over her face. "You know, I bought a house on the island, and in my spare time I study events that have taken place there."
"I told the investigators everything," Anita replied, "and there's nothing more I can add."
She turned her head to the window, as if she'd considered the conversation over. "I think I found something the investigators missed," Jack mentioned. Anita pressed her lips together even tighter, making them into a thin scarlet line.
"I don't want to go back to Kìltem. My whole family died there, and I've broken all ties to the place."
"You're the only one who survived, and I need to hear your testimony, pure and simple," he insisted. Grimacing in pain, Anita reached for the button to call the nurse. Before she could press it, though, Jack held up to her face an enlargement of the photograph showing the unknown black-haired woman wearing beads. "I need to know who this woman was. Then I'll leave right away." Anita cast a cursory glance at the image. At the sight of the girl, she narrowed her eyes. She pulled back the hand reaching for the button. "Do you know her? There's no record of her. Yet she was demonstrably on the island in July 1923, less than 8 months before the massacre. This picture is the only thing that proves she ever existed, in fact."
"Yes, of course,"
Anita said with a bitter edge to her voice. "Who is she then?"
"Her name was Rebecca. She lived with us before the incident. She got off Harry's boat one day because she'd arranged on the mainland that she would stay with him. At that time, everyone had a secret. But what can you keep secret on an island that you can almost throw a stone across? She was a girl without a home. Apparently, She'd had a very troubled childhood.
What happened to her?
It was said that her father was a fisherman and her mother mended nets. But one day they both got fish poisoning. She was the only one who survived. Naturally, no one will ever know if it's true,
she said. When did Rebecca leave the island? It must have been before the massacre, because she wasn't listed among the victims.
Yes, she disappeared shortly before that. I don't know why. There was a thick wall between the world of adults and the world of children at the time, you know. Rumour had it that she'd run off with a friend of Harry's, that she'd had affairs with several men.
Were the men married? The corners of Anita's mouth twitched.
Of course, the only single man was Harry.
And the parson? Anita's eyes glazed over for a moment.
Even the parson had a wife. I think her name was Sophie Gordon.
She paused, and in that pause, Jack's eyes conjured up the image of a woman with an axe in her head.
Is the chapel on Kìltem still standing?
Yes, it's still there, Jack confirmed. What else did people say about Rebecca? He prompted.
That she was a witch, that she had cast some evil spell on the islanders. The people in those parts have always been terribly superstitious, and they still are, at least from what I've heard, that they covered the island with crosses.
It's true, Jack confirmed. Anita just grinned.
Tush! As though they had thought a handful of worthless stone crucifixes would stop the devil, like making a cross of your fingers to ward off a vampire.
Did you believe the accusations?
Of course. Everyone believed them. When she walked by, we threw stones at her and shouted, "Fly back to hell, witch!" We were just kids.
You were 16, Jack reminded her.
Yes, but being 16 in those days was not the same as being 16 today. Back then, when you were 21, you couldn't stay out after dark, let alone spend the night away from home.
With a boyfriend?
Boyfriend?
Anita snorted derisively.
Having sex before marriage would get you thrown out of the house and excommunicated. It's not like that today, when 14-year-old girls are going to discos, wearing T-shirts with cleavage down to their navels and coming home at dawn. When these young lasses start taking birth control pills almost as soon as they get their first period.
Jack stared at her open-mouthed.
Why are you looking at me like that?
She chided.
I've worked as a psychiatrist all my life, and I've heard a lot of stories.
Do you still believe that story about the witch today? He stammered.
No, not today. There are no supernatural forces. I'm a doctor, and I believe in science and scientifically proven facts.
You cut all ties with your foster parents when you were 21. Why?
Personal reasons.
Can you elaborate?
No, I cannot. I don't see what my leaving my foster parents has to do with the Kìltem Massacre.
Jack lowered his eyes. You're right. Sorry. So what do you think caused the tragedy?
Closed society syndrome. Cabin fever. A pressure cooker from which no air can escape. One of these people just went crazy and unleashed an avalanche.
So you don't believe it was the devil's doing?
People have always had a tendency to blame others, haven't they, Mr. Collin, to find the true culprit. They're just not willing to admit that they're the only culprits.
Are you telling me that all those people were crazy? Jack didn't believe it.
All humans are potential madmen.
Potential?
It depends how far we push the boundaries.
What do you mean?
I mean that obsessions, phobias, or depressions, which were overlooked and downplayed in the past, are now recognized illnesses that are treated. Children are either hyperactive and need calming down, or withdrawn and require therapy, not like 60 years ago.
But they weren't withdrawn or hyperactive. They committed murder. Anita fell silent. Jack felt that her silence did not mean she was admitting defeat, but was intended to underline the sentence she was about to say. At last she said,
"Every human is a potential murderer."
"You can't be serious."
"I've studied the human psyche all my life, Mr. Collin, and I do mean it. Does the phrase, the miracles in the Andes, mean anything to you?"
No, Jack shook his head.
"It refers to an incident in 1972 when a plane carrying a Uruguayan rugby team crashed in the Andes. The survivors spent 72 days in the freezing mountain wilderness. 10 days after the crash, they learned that authorities were calling off the search. Food supplies were running low. What now? All these lads were good Catholics, but they ate the bodies of their friends to survive. Under certain circumstances, everyone is capable of cannibalism, and everyone is capable of murder."
The men on the plane, the rugby team. We can understand that they might eat human flesh. They had no choice.
"They could have starved to death,"
Anita smiled. Okay, but what damn reason did the people of Kìltem have for the mass murder of their loved ones? Jack was almost shouting. Anita shrugged.
"I don't know, but as a psychiatrist, I suspect there must be one."
What reason? Jack demanded.
"Maybe they blamed the victims for their own failures."
I'm sorry?
Deep down, everyone harbours a sense of grievance, a feeling that someone else is to blame for their failures.
Sensible people know that they are to blame for their own problems, Jack countered.
"That's true,"
Anita conceded.
"Sensible people also know that eating human flesh is wrong, but under certain circumstances."
I refuse to admit that a sense of grievance was behind the massacre.
"When reason and emotion clash, reason doesn't need to come out on top,"
Anita hit back.
"Look, as a psychiatrist, I can tell you that we all have these thoughts. They're seeds we've picked up along the way through life. We know they're bad seeds that we must never plant, but at the same time, we can't get rid of them. All we could do is lock them away in some stuffy room and try to forget about them. So the farmer lives by his conscience. He plants only good seeds, but sometimes they don't produce a crop. Sometimes the harvest is ruined by water, sometimes by rats. So the farmer plants again, but this time the good seeds don't sprout at all, and the farmer's thoughts stray to the bad seeds that are locked away. They would have sprouted for sure. He just knows he can't use them. He waits a year, 2, 3. He starts to go hungry. I know from experience that most people are able to resist the temptation, but some do plant the bad seeds."
But on Kìltem, everyone committed murder, Jack declared triumphantly. Anita just smiled again.
"You know what's interesting about bad seeds, Mr. Collin? Even though a strong individual refuses to plant them, in time they simply sprout all by themselves."
After his conversation with Anita, Jack left the retirement home drained. He hadn't met a shaky old woman whose speech faltered, but a vigorous, energetic woman he wasn't able to get the upper hand over in their discussion. Anita McCafferty could easily have lectured to packed auditoriums if her physical condition permitted it. Her conclusions struck him as radical and implausible. There was logic to them, though, and if he really had to choose between the devil and the bad seeds, he'd go with the seeds. but drop peas in the shape of a sigil of Baphomet. Jack didn't know. The meeting with Anita had brought more questions than answers. When he got back to the island that evening, he took Ellie for a walk. They strolled along the cliffs between the crosses, the wind coming in from the sea ruffling their hair. Jack told Ellie all he had found out in Edinburgh and waited for her opinion. "You aren't going to carry on, I hope?" she asked. Jack shrugged. "This has become an obsession. You won't make any new discoveries anyway." "I already have," he reminded her. "But even so, you can't bring back the past. Please, it's unhealthy to keep going over the same things again and again." "It doesn't affect me. I work with death every day." "You said you wanted to hand in your notice at the hospice, didn't you?" Jack was silent. "Why don't we just move away?" Ellie suggested. "I don't want to go anywhere else," said Jack. "I've fallen in love with this island. I've fallen in love with Kìltem. Let's try living here together. We'll move in together. We'll sell one house and enlarge the other. And if kids follow..." Ellie bowed her head. "I know I haven't talked about it yet. I'm sorry if this is too fast for you." She broke away from him. "Haven't you thought about our future?" "Our future?" she snapped at him. "We don't even know each other yet. We don't know anything about each other, and you are already talking about children." "I'm sorry, but we can't just stand still." Ellie turned and looked out to sea. "If you think we have a future together, that is," Jack added. Ellie was silent for a long time. "Anyone who lives in a place like this was either born there or was running away from something." "What did you run away from?" She was silent for a long time. "You don't have to tell me, at least not now. If you're not ready to," Jack reassured her. "And if you really want us to move away, we will." "No, I want to live here and with you, but promise you'll end your research as soon as possible." "I promise," Jack said. Ellie's request seemed to fill him with energy. There was a lot of questions he needed answers to, like why Anita ran away from her foster family, what she was like as a student and as a doctor. Why did she choose psychiatry? "I'll try to find her foster family first," Ellie announced on the morning ferry. "They'll be long dead." "But siblings might not be." In the hospice's office, Jack dialed the foster care switchboard in Glasgow. He introduced himself and asked for the identities of all the members of the family where 16-year-old Anita McCafferty had been placed in 1924. "We're sorry, but we can't provide that information." "I'm her doctor," Jack lied. "Not even to her doctor." "And is there any way? My patient is writing her will, you see, and she really doesn't know anything about her siblings." "She would have to apply herself or sign a notarized power of attorney." "She has severe arthritis. She can't hold a pen in her hand anymore. Can't you at least tell me their names?" "Are you telling me that your patient doesn't remember the names of her family members?" "Well, she is very old. Her memory is failing." "But she still wants to make a will?" Jack swallowed. "What did you say your name was?" Jack hung up. His career as a private investigator was over after one phone call. But how else could he figure out the details of Anita's siblings? Forge her signature on a power of attorney? Offer a bribe? He could wind up in jail for something like that. That afternoon, he admitted to Ellie that he'd hit a wall. The petite redhead smiled archly. She took some printed sheets of paper out of her backpack and handed them to Jack. An extract from the Glasgow Foster Care Archive. Ellie had highlighted the Smith family in green marker. Amy, 30th of the 12th, 1880. John, 29th of the 4th, 1879. Application to foster orphans, December
1920. Home address,
Fort William, Acantor Road, PH 33, 6RW. Names of children placed in their care. Domhall,
28th of the 5th, 1908. Ivor, 11th of the 8th, 1911. Darragh, 23rd of the 9th, 1913. Joe, 28th of the 9th, 1914. And Anita, 29th of the 4th, 1908. Where did you find it? Jack gasped excitedly.
You can find everything on the internet.
Later that evening, he and Ellie scoured the net and discovered that none of Smith's children were alive except Anita. But their descendants were. USA, Canada, Australia. The only one within reasonable distance was one Paul Wing, son of Domhall Wing, one of Anita's brothers. Wing lived in Edinburgh and agreed to meet Jack. When the red door of a house in South Gyle near the airport had opened the next day, a tall, energetic man with a thick mop of silver hair was shaking Jack's hand. He ushered him in and asked what tea he could offer him. Jack asked for green tea and sank into a soft armchair in the living room. Paul Wing returned with a magnificent tea service, which included a stand with a burning candle to keep the tea from getting cold in the pot. I was prepared for any tea request you might have, he remarked. Tea is my hobby. And now that I am retired, I have plenty of time to devote to it. What brings you here? It's about your father, Jack began. He was raised by adoptive parents as a child. Wing nodded to indicate that he was well aware of his father's past. According to the local welfare office's archives, a total of 5 children were placed in Mr. and Mrs. Smith's care. One of them was Anita McCafferty. Yes, the girl who survived the Kìltem Massacre, he said gravely. You see, I'm doing some research into what happened on the island then, and I need to find out some information about Miss McCafferty. What kind of information? Why did she run away from her foster parents when she was 21, for example? Paul Wing sighed. I have no idea. No one knew, not even my father. She got along fine with the Smiths. You know, they weren't the kind of schemers who are in it for the money and maybe neglect the children in their charge. They were both over 40 and took fostering seriously. My father would never hear a bad word said against his parents. Later, after he'd left home, he would visit them every year. He had no recollection of any event that might explain Anita's departure. It was weird, especially considering the fact that Anita's 21st birthday was apparently a very amicable affair. What's more, she'd been given a rather expensive present, a sewing machine. Really? Sure, she'd wanted one for ages. She worked as a seamstress and was very eager to sew at home, Wing explained. As soon as she disappeared, John and Amy wanted to look for her, but they received a letter telling them she'd gone to America and did not wish them to search for her. My father said there was nothing personal in the note, just the bare facts. Was it in Anita's handwriting? Wing nodded. The Smiths recognized her handwriting. Then they asked the other kids if Anita had confided in them about any problems, but no one knew of anything. Even though Anita's departure affected them, they respected her wishes. They never looked for her or tried to contact her. Jack spent a few seconds considering what he'd heard. He pondered. How many days after her birthday did she leave exactly? Paul Wing gave him a serious look. 3. Jack deliberately missed his bus and decided to visit Anita. He needed answers, and she was the only one who could give them to him. Good afternoon, Anita, Jack said as he entered her room. Anita was lying on the bed like last time. She had no makeup on, though. It was clear she hadn't expected any visitors today.
You're unannounced,
she grumbled. I know, but I'd like to ask you a few questions if you don't mind. Anita smiled.
If you grab hold of something, you don't let go, do you, Mr. Collin?
Jack nodded.
You don't really think you can crack the mystery, do you?
Jack sat down on the chair. Maybe we can crack it together. I'm intrigued by your theory, the one about bad seeds. I like it because it's rational, no silly superstitions, but I need you to be more specific. What bad seeds did Rebecca put in the villagers' heads? Anita hesitated for a long time. Finally she said,
She didn't have to supply them. We all have the seeds already. All she had to do was discover them and sow them.
So what bad seeds did she discover and sow in the ferryman's head?
Harry, well, I can only guess, of course. I was 16 and didn't know what went on behind his closed doors, but I suppose she aroused feelings of inferiority in him.
Inferiority about what?
That he had no family, that he lived on the island alone. Somehow he got it into his head that his loneliness was the fault of others.
The ones he murdered? Matt Johnson and Terry White?
Along with their families,
she added. How did he work that out?
He didn't, of course. The point was to create the illusion of their guilt. Matt and Terry were Harry's classmates and peers, blood brothers, if you will. Rebecca evidently awakened some painful memory in his mind, maybe even a fairly trivial one. Harry might have been the least bold of the three, timid even. Matt and Terry, for example, once said, "You're a scaredy cat, you'll never get married," and boom, that was it. The irrational seed was planted.
Did she sleep with him?
She slept with everyone. The whole village began to live in sin after she turned up.
How was that possible? These men had families, children. Why didn't they drive a slut like that off the island?
They enjoyed her company,
Anita replied.
They sought her out. They could talk to her for hours. They invited her into their homes.
What did their wives say?
They were silent. What else could they do? Don't forget, this was early 20th century Scotland. In those days, the man was in charge of everything in the family.
Do you think that's why the women on Kìltem also turned into killers?
Of course, they hated their unfaithful husbands. They killed their children as well because they saw them in their own image.
How exactly was Rebecca different?
You've seen her. She had long raven hair and she was slim and pretty.
How old was she?
I wouldn't have known, except that I happened to overhear Parson Gordon mention her age. 16.
Jack paused. In that picture she looks...
Older,
Anita finished his sentence. Did these men open up to a 16-year-old lassie?
She was 16 biologically, but she gave the impression that she had already been through a lot in life, that she had an old soul. She naturally inspired confidence in people.
Did she go to Mass?
No, that's why the parson mentioned it. He was indignant. He didn't understand why the little heathen wasn't thrown out.
But the parson also turned killer, Jack recalled. He even started off the whole bloody rampage, according to the police detectives. He split his wife's skull with an axe. Anita smiled.
Yes, poor Sophie. Gordon resisted for a long time, but eventually she got him too. She won him over by starting to go to Mass and confession.
Jack was suddenly overcome with curiosity about Anita's opinion of the family of his predecessors, as Ellie had called him the other day. I live in Farmer Brendan O'Neill's house. Why did he stab his wife with a pitchfork in the barn?
Maybe he blamed her for his impotence.
I'm sorry?
I'm just guessing. Maybe he lost his desire for his wife after he had sex with Rebecca. She'd grown fat after having children, after all. Brendan simply said out loud what he was thinking.
What about the men who killed other men?
Jealousy. They were simply disposing of Rebecca's lovers.
Jack let Anita's words resonate inside him. So they all killed out of sexual frustration.
Mostly, but not always. Pete, the worst drunk, killed Liam, the owner of the mottled sheep, because he refused to serve him, and when he did, he charged him more for his whiskey. After the murder, Pete ransacked Liam's bar before drunkenly staggering off to the cliffs and jumping because Rebecca gave him the idea that all his drinking problems were his own fault. One young lad tried to kill his friends because they had, fancy that, bigger muscles than him. Unfortunately, he only tried. They ended up killing him. I also remember a local teacher. He was assured by Rebecca that it was harmful to suppress your natural urges, so he raped a 10-year-old schoolgirl, then his own children, and he kicked to death the woman who tried to stop him. When he was done, he walked down the street, killing random men because he envied them for never suffering as he did. Finally, disgusted by his actions, he committed a gruesome hara-kiri on himself.
How did Rebecca know the teacher was turned on by some schoolgirl? How did she know Brendan O'Neill would blame his wife for his impotence? How in the world did she find out about any of Harry's old memory of marriage?
She had a gift, Anita said. She could see into people's souls. All it took was one little sign, a well-placed snowball, and an avalanche would start. I'm sure you have something you're suppressing.
Me? Nothing, Jack protested. I don't envy anyone. I'm not jealous of anyone, and I don't hate anyone. I've no childhood scars and no sexual frustrations. I have a girlfriend I'm planning a future with, a job that I don't hugely enjoy, but don't grumble about either. I live in Scotland, the country I want to live in. I have never sought psychiatric help, I don't have mood swings, and I don't suffer from any mental illness. I'm not full of suppressed aggression. I can assure you, the only thing I suffer from is an aversion to mysteries and jobs left unfinished. Anita laughed.
Jack, you are so full of pent-up aggression, and you have too many bad seeds in you to count. Why else would you be here in front of me so vehemently defending your sanity? If you had lived on Kìltem 84 years ago, you would have become a killer like everyone else.
Bullshit, Jack said. See, I'm not suppressing anything. I wanted to say bullshit to a crazy old thing like you, and I did. I would never murder anyone, not even if I was in the right, drunk, or on drugs. Why did you leave your foster parents?
They weren't kind to me.
In what way?
I didn't feel love from them. They were only after money. They liked the boys more than me. They ignored me and didn't encourage my hobbies.
They gave you an expensive sewing machine for your birthday.
The sewing machine, that was the last straw.
But you'd longed for one. You worked as a seamstress and longed to sew at home.
I didn't enjoy sewing. And the only reason I worked as a seamstress was because they couldn't get me another job in Fort William. I didn't want a sewing machine at all, Mr. Collin. I was only given it so I could work at home and bring more money in for the Smiths.
Jack left Anita that day wondering whether she had lied to him or Paul Wing had lied to him. He didn't know. It was a complete mystery. He returned to Edinburgh a few days later. This time he decided to meet Dr. Agnew, Anita's former colleague. "Do you mind sitting on the couch where my patients sit?" Agnew said cheerfully, motioning to a divan set at right angles to his desk. "I'd like to talk to you face to face, but I don't have any other chairs in my practice room." Jack shook his head to indicate that he didn't mind. "You told me on the phone you wanted to talk to me about Anita McCafferty." "Yes, you were colleagues. Do you know her well?" "In professional terms, yes," said Agnew, who was certainly approaching 70. "That's the side of her I'm interested in," Jack said, nodding. "What was she like as a psychiatrist?" "Very good," the doctor assured Jack. Then he hesitated. "At least mostly." "I don't understand." "Her results were exceptional, exceptionally good, but unfortunately also exceptionally bad.
She cured patients that her colleagues were at a loss over, but some of her patients,
Agnew continued slowly,
did not get better. What's more, they came to tragic ends.
Jack leaned forward slightly. Tragic?
Yes, they killed themselves, and they usually took other people with them. Family, friends, neighbours. That's the worst thing that can happen to a psychiatrist. It's like a house falling down for a site architect with innocent victims buried in the rubble.
Why didn't the medical board do anything?
Do what?
Take action. If a house fell down and people died in the rubble, the site foreman would end up in court.
Oh dear, that obviously wasn't a suitable comparison,
Agnew grimaced.
You see, building a house and treating a mentally ill person are two entirely different things. A site architect is an engineer who works with exact, precisely calculable numbers, so any failure is his fault. A psychiatrist's work is different. There are few, if any, universally valid procedures. It differs from patient to patient, and a case-by-case approach is required. I'll give you an example. Take someone suffering from insomnia. For some, good sleep hygiene is enough to cure them. For others, group therapy will help. Others will benefit from herbs or antidepressants. Some just need to avoid stress stimuli. Sometimes a combination of multiple treatments will bring success. There are some people who cure their insomnia naturally, all by themselves, and there are others who never get better. A better analogy occurs to me. A psychiatrist is like a teacher who simply cannot be held responsible for his pupils' academic results.
In high-risk cases like that, Anita should have ensured her patients were institutionalized. Put them under lock and key, Jack said, standing his ground.
These people never harmed anyone before. They weren't aggressive repeat offenders. It was the first time they'd done anything like that. Anita defended her actions before the board. The hundreds of successes that put her colleagues in the shade. I myself, for example, at the very beginning of my practice, treated a patient suffering from a fear of the dark, a patient I couldn't make any progress with. No sooner did I turn off the lights than he would begin to sweat and shake. Eventually, I referred him to Anita, who was already an experienced doctor with a reputation. And she cured him within a week. The young lad was no longer afraid of the dark. 99.9% of her results were good, but now and again, some, as I said, were bad. They were rare.
Dr. Agnew paused, as if hesitating to finish the sentence.
But regular.
Jack looked into his eyes. How do you mean regular? Agnew looked like he regretted his last words.
Well, if I didn't know it was nonsense, I'd say they happened rarely enough not to arouse suspicion, about once every 5 years.
Jack was on his way back to Kìltem. As the bow of the boat pierced the dark blue waves, he thought about Anita. He struggled to believe that she had somehow magically taken control of her patient's will and sentenced selected unfortunates to death.
For the first time, it occurred to him that Anita and Rebecca were one and the same person.
But that was nonsense, of course. In the old pictures, Anita was a fair-haired girl with freckles, while Rebecca was a dark-haired girl with coal-black eyes. For a while, Jack speculated that Rebecca was a persona Anita adopted. She'd put on a wig and hide her freckles with makeup, but he dismissed the silly notion out of hand. On an isolated island in the early 20th century. Unrealistic. Besides, he remembered, they were both photographed at the same time in a group photo taken on the 24th of July, 1923. Anita was squatting in the middle of the front row. Rebecca was at the end of the second row. When Anita spoke to him about Rebecca, she wasn't lying, and yet Jack was certain she'd led him on a merry dance like a little boy. At home, he had a shower, changed his clothes, and headed over to Ellie's. If he'd known what a bombshell Ellie had for him, he wouldn't have bothered with showering or changing. "I found something good," his girlfriend greeted him from the sofa. She was eating a chocolate muffin and drinking tea. "Aren't you going to ask what I found out in Edinburgh?" Jack sighed wearily. "All right, what did you find out?" "The psychiatrist, a colleague of Anita's, told me that Anita was an outstanding doctor. Nevertheless, every 5 years or so, one of her patients killed himself. Even though I know it's nonsense, I can't shake off the idea of Anita and Rebecca being one and the same person." Jack sat down beside Ellie. He ruffled her red hair and reached for a muffin. "What do you have for me then?" Instead of answering, Ellie silently pushed her laptop towards him. "Study record, the University of Edinburgh, Anita McCafferty." "How on earth did you get—"
Jack suddenly choked on a piece of muffin. He had come to the photo from Anita's school. Before then, he'd only seen that face once, but he recognized it immediately, framed by long raven hair with beads around her neck. Rebecca.
Ellie pounded the choking Jack in the back.
"I told you I'd found something good."
"Good!" Jack gasped. "This is sensational, but it means—"
"It means that Rebecca was somehow responsible for the deaths on Kìltem, and she fled the island just before the massacre. But there was a flaw in her perfect plan. A living witness, Anita. I believe she kidnapped Anita from her foster parents, forced her to write a letter, and then killed her. Using her identity, she then went to Edinburgh to study psychiatry."
"But there are a couple of hitches," Jack considered. "For instance, why did she only get rid of Anita 5 years after the Kìltem Massacre? After all, she could have turned her in at any point during that time."
"She couldn't get rid of her right away. It would be a signal that the real killer was covering his tracks. Rebecca had to wait for a time when emotions had cooled and when the disappearance of a sole surviving witness wouldn't arouse suspicion."
The year when Anita came of age, in other words. Ellie nodded. "How did she get rid of the body?"
"There are lots of possibilities. She could have thrown it into the sea in a sack filled with rocks, or buried it somewhere in the middle of a forest."
"But why did she apply to study in Edinburgh under Anita's name? She was taking a terrible risk."
"This was almost 90 years ago, don't forget. For people living in Malik, Edinburgh was the far side of the world. Nobody there knew the real Anita. There was no living relatives, and she made it clear to her foster family in her letter that she did not want them to come looking for her."
Ellie pondered.
"But otherwise, I agree with you. It was a risk."
"One hell of a risk," Jack mused.
"Maybe she couldn't use her real name,"
Ellie suggested.
"Maybe the police were looking for her real identity."
"Do you think she was guilty of a crime? I mean, she was 16.
"She was 16 and had already killed 116 islanders and the sole surviving witness. I think she'd killed before."
"But who?" Ellie pondered. It was Jack who broke the silence. "How did you get hold of the information in the first place?"
"You can find everything on the internet."
Jack remembered his recent phone call to the foster care headquarters in Glasgow. But the archives of the University of Edinburgh can't be publicly accessible.
"You're right, but that doesn't mean you can't access them."
She paused.
"You just have to be clever about it."
"You broke into it?"
"You're not going to turn me in, are you?"
Ellie said, making puppy dog eyes at Jack. "You're a hacker."
"Sort of,"
Ellie said, shrugging her freckled shoulders and popping the last piece of her muffin into her mouth. "Could you get inside the police's cold case database?" Jack asked. Ellie's eyes flashed.
"You're thinking of Rebecca's parents' death."
"Yes, maybe it wasn't caused by fish poisoning at all."
But Rebecca herself...
Ellie started tapping away on her laptop keyboard. Jack walked over to the sideboard and took out a bottle of whiskey.
What will we do if we find the truth? Ellie asked. Do we report to the police that we found her murderer from the beginning of the last century?
Maybe, Jack conceded. A Scottish Jack the Ripper, he chuckled.
But what will they do with an old woman like her?
German war criminals were also hanged eventually, even though they were old men who could barely walk.
But face it, there isn't any evidence in this case.
We have evidence, Jack reminded her.
Which we can't use,
Ellie replied, looking at him seriously. Jack sighed. I'll have to persuade her to confess somehow.
You can do it, Ellie said, patting Jack's hand. She's 100 years old and she's bound to be a bit muddle-headed.
She's sharper than you'd think, Jack said gravely. The next day, shortly after noon, he knocked on the door of Anita's room and entered without being asked.
You spend more time here than at home,
Anita greeted him, not seeming the least bit surprised.
Won't Ellie be jealous?
Jack desperately tried to remember whether he had mentioned his girlfriend's name to Anita.
What brings you this time?
I want to know what kind of psychiatrist you were.
A good one, I'd say, but you must have found out this information by now, haven't you, Mr. Collin?
Jack nodded.
Which of my colleagues did you ask about me? Dr. Agnew? It must have been him. He's known me the longest, and he's still practicing. Did that fool tell you about my failures? The patients who took their own lives? I'm sure he did. He couldn't pass up on an opportunity like this to denigrate a woman who'd outperformed him.
Are you telling me that the tragic cases didn't happen?
No, they did. Of course they did, Mr. Collin. Trying to cure a mentally ill man is like trying to start a fire with a piece of flint. You strike and strike, but you know full well you'll rarely start a fire that way. An experienced arsonist knows that all you have to do is simply dip a rag in petrol and flick a lighter. In this case, unfortunately, there's always the risk that the flames will spread and take lives. Look at the history of any human activity and you will see that I am right. You can either play it safe and do a mediocre job, or you can take appropriate risks and commit to great things. Every invention in sporting first is always paid for by a series of fatal mistakes and losses. The scales have to be balanced. Freud laid the foundations of modern psychiatry, but he smoked so many cigars that they took his life. Dr. Agnew was, is, and always will be a mediocre physician. I was black and white. It's true, I have a few failures in my track record, but I've cured patients others couldn't get anywhere with.
Like the boy who was afraid of the dark, Jack mentioned.
Oh,
Anita smiled.
Of course, Tony. That fool Agnew didn't realise what exactly Tony's fears stem from. He didn't realise that the poor lad's father was beating him and then locking him in a cupboard while he raped his wife.
And you realised that?
I saw it, said Anita firmly. I saw the scars on his knuckles, made in a desperate effort to free himself from the cupboard. I saw his eyes narrow angrily whenever I said the word father. He loved his mother and suffered when she was taken from him.
An Oedipus complex?
What young man doesn't suffer from it?
How did you cure him? The wrinkled face beneath Anita's white hair brightened.
You know, Tony wasn't exactly a boy anymore. He was 18. He lived with his mother, who'd finally come to her senses and left his father. His mother didn't know that his father locked him in the closet when he raped her. She thought he was afraid of ghosts or some kind of boogeyman. It was easy to cure Tony. I told him to go to his father, lock him in the cupboard and let him starve to death. We discussed in detail exactly how to do it, how to nail the door shut with planks of wood and how to cover his tracks.
You planned a murder.
I didn't see it as planning a murder. I saw it as treating a patient.
Why did you decide to actually study psychiatry in the first place?
Because of Freud.
Really?
Human life revolves only around sexuality. That has never changed and never will change.
Freud said that?
Of course,
Anita replied.
he was a very observant man, and he had a way of hitting the nail on the head.
He founded psychoanalysis, Jack remarked. Anita looked pleased.
The motivation of human behavior is determined by unconscious processes secretly going on in the subconscious.
Did you meet him?
No, I wanted to, but I didn't. He died when I was 31.
I heard he spent his last days in London.
Yes, he fled there from the threat of Nazism. He had cancer of the upper jaw because he smoked too many cigars, but refused sedatives. When the pain became unbearable, he asked his doctor, Max Schur, for a lethal dose of morphine.
Like you, Jack remarked.
I don't have cancer of the upper jaw,
Anita said. But you refused to take painkillers. Anita looked down at her hands, disfigured with arthritis.
Yes, I think we both did it for the same reason.
To stop drugs from dulling your mind? She nodded. Are you going to ask for a lethal dose of morphine too?
My pain is still manageable.
Jack moved his chair closer to her bed. But if other circumstances should arise that would aggravate your condition, circumstances that have nothing to do with physical pain.
What exactly do you have in mind?
I mean, if it somehow came out that you killed your parents when you were 16, Rebecca. The woman was silent for a long time. Jack waited for her reaction. She couldn't escape in her condition. She didn't have the strength to get rid of him like she'd once got rid of Anita. She was at his mercy. Would she beg, make promises, or obstinately insist that the accusation wasn't true? But the old woman lying in the hospital bed surprised him.
I was 15 when I killed my parents.
It wasn't fish poisoning, stammered Jack, startled.
No, it wasn't.
And Anita?
Her bones are now lying under the mud somewhere at the bottom of Loch Morar.
She confessed! Jack exclaimed triumphantly as soon as Ellie opened the door. They sat down at the kitchen table and Ellie put on the kettle. What did she say? She corrected me that she wasn't 16 when she killed her parents, but 15. Oh my God, why did she do that? I didn't get a chance to ask. A doctor came in and announced that visiting hours were over. I'm going to see her tomorrow. Aren't you afraid? Of an old woman like that? She should be afraid of me.
Do you plan to tell the police?
It depends on how cooperative she is. I want to know her whole story from her childhood to the present.
You don't like leaving jobs unfinished, Ellie smiled.
Or mysteries unsolved, Jack added with satisfaction. Later that evening, they sat by the fireplace with glasses of whiskey and looked into the flames.
Maybe we could move in together after all,
Ellie said. Jack's face lit up. Ellie, that's wonderful. That's great. That's...
But before you do, though, she interrupted, there's something you should know about me.
Jack fell silent. He remembered the conversation on the cliff. Ellie's secret she wasn't ready to share. By remaining silent, he invited Ellie to speak and made clear he was ready to hear what she had to say. Ellie finished her whiskey, reached for the bottle and poured herself another glass. It was only when she'd taken another sip that she spoke.
You already know that my boyfriend left me before I came to Kìltem.
Jack nodded.
But you don't know the reason he left me, and I need to tell you before we take the next step.
Jack nodded. He squeezed Ellie's hand tightly to give her courage and reminded her that he was on her side. She took another sip of whiskey.
I have endometriosis, she said. I can't get pregnant.
Jack froze. His grip on her hand slackened a little.
If you want to live with me, you have to accept that we won't have children, just like I've accepted that.
Jack hadn't expected anything like this. He realized how important it had always been to him to start a big family. Children! His brain was working at full speed. Could you leave Ellie? Could you walk away from the woman you love and have imagined spending the rest of your life with just because she couldn't give you children?
I don't need you to answer now,
Ellie said, looking at him. The freckled face peeping out from behind her red curls was pale and sad.
Take time to digest it, and don't be afraid to tell me the truth. It won't hurt me. I'm used to.
Tears literally sprang from her eyes. She dropped her whiskey glass and slumped into Jack's lap.
Please don't leave me, please don't,
she sobbed as she soaked his shirt with her tears. Jack stroked her hair in silence. He was staring into the flames and thinking. I want to hear your whole story, he said straight out without greeting her, and no sooner than he'd sat down on the chair in Anita's room. Everything, even the smallest details. If you don't tell me, I'll turn you into the police. Anita smiled at Jack.
You're very impatient today, Mr. Collin. You didn't even take the time to knock or say hello. Any problems?
It's you who has a problem, miss, Jack exploded. You heard. Speak. Anita sighed.
I reckon everyone should confess before he dies, to ease one's conscience, and I really don't have much time left. What do you want to hear first?
About the family you killed. Your childhood.
My childhood?
Anita raised her eyebrows.
Are you prepared to hear nasty things?
I've studied the Kìltem Massacre for almost a year. I'm ready for anything.
All right.
Anita looked out the window as if she might see her pass through it. She took a deep breath and began her story.
I was born in Blairgowrie on the 29th of April, 1908. Our cottage was not by the sea, as I had told the people of Kìltem, but in a remote spot among the fields. My father was not a fisherman, and my mother did not mend fishing nets. They did not die from fish poisoning. In reality, they were both victims of the Great Depression after the First World War. My father lost his job in a coal mine, and my mother supported the whole family by slaving from morning to night for a pittance in the local factory. I remember being constantly hungry. My unemployed father, who waited for me every day when I returned from school, was usually drunk and bad-tempered. He would constantly put me down, saying I was a burden to them. I only took and contributed nothing. He kept saying how ugly, stupid and clumsy I was. You don't have to be a psychiatrist, Mr. Collin, to guess what a child like that will grow up to be. A self-conscious and stammering wallflower who stares at the ground when somebody talks to them. I desperately needed support, to be told I was special. And you know what? A miracle happened. At the age of 12, my father suddenly started saying all the nice things I needed to hear, that I was pretty and smart and clever. But I soon realized that it wasn't a guilty conscience that was behind the change, but lust. He began to abuse me, and I didn't fight back. I didn't resist, because for the first time in my life he would flatter me. No one knew about it. My mother came home every night exhausted and hardly took any interest in me, nor did my teachers or classmates. The only one who cared about me was my father.
Anita reached for a glass of water and took a sip.
At the age of 15, however, someone else became interested in me. The devil would come to me in my dreams. He told me that what my father was doing to me was wrong, and that I had to stop it, that I had to get rid of him, and that I had to get rid of my mother too, because she knew what was going on when she wasn't at home and didn't care. He told me about the mysteries of the human psyche, that understanding the principles of the mind is like finding the Holy Grail, and that people who can do that can do anything. He spoke to me in a calm, soothing voice. He told me about my great qualities, that he'd chosen me out of thousands of others, He said that if I accepted him into my life, he would give me a gift that would cause no one to hurt me anymore. That in turn, I would be able to control others and write their destinies. It was the best thing that ever happened to me in my life. I've never regretted it. You know, Mr. Colin, selling your soul to the devil isn't as bad as the movies make it out to be. You don't suffer nightmares. You don't feel fire burning your skin. You aren't boiled alive.
Do you think it will stay that way after you die? Jack prompted. Anita was taken aback by the question.
I am convinced that if you serve someone faithfully, he has no reason to punish you,
she said at last.
Being a disciple of God or the devil is one and the same thing. Both have tools they use to reward you for being faithful to them, and tools they use to punish you if you cheat them, and I have always been obedient.
How exactly did you kill your parents with the devil's help?
With the most powerful weapon ever invented in the world. Words. I was given precise instructions on what to say and when to say it. I was like an inexperienced actor who first has to commit to memory every line and movement he will make on stage, and only then can he go out and perform in front of an audience. The devil comforted me by telling me that all the great thinkers and leaders in human history, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Kim Jong-un, had once gone to school. But I didn't mind learning. I wanted to be a good student, and I knew for sure that one day I would write my own dramas like them. I practiced and practiced until one day the devil told me to wait for a sign.
What was the sign?
The sigil of Baphomet. He showed me what it looked like in a dream, and then I looked for it every day. In the sky, in puddles, on crockery. I didn't have to wait long. On the third night, I accidentally spilled a vase of beads, and it materialized out of thin air. Quite clear and regular. I remember that I could hardly breathe. Even though I believed my nightly conversations with the devil to be true, there was also this worm gnawing at me, making me wonder if I was hallucinating. A lonely, abused girl living with an overbearing father and an overworked mother somewhere among the fields would have been susceptible to hallucinations. The sigil gave me confidence. Then I went into the kitchen where my parents were arguing and said my line. "Mother! Father told me I'm prettier than you!" It was like casting a spell, like grabbing the right key out of a million different ones and turning it in the lock. One sentence, 9 words, a precisely aimed snowball that would start an avalanche. My mother started yelling at my father, saying that she knew that he was a filthy pig, that he'd go to jail, bringing shame on the whole family. My father said he had no choice, because she had become withdrawn from him. My mother shouted that if he hadn't just lounged around the house like a slob, he would have understood how exhausting her job was. He said that he would happily work if he could find a job, and so on. All the pent-up emotions and aggression were released all at once, like a rubbish bag bursting open. The bad seed sprouted. The quarrel ended in a fight, and ultimately in death. Standing in the doorway, I watched my father plunge a knife into my mother's chest. He pulled the knife out and looked at me angrily. Then he came towards me. Do you want to know if I was afraid? No, I wasn't. I knew I was under the protection of the devil. I'd done everything he wanted me to do. My father walked up to me, lifted his bloody hands, and then stroked my cheek. "I'm sorry, Rebecca," he said. "I'm sorry for everything I did to you." Then he took a rope out of a drawer and asked if I could tie it noose. I did. By the time I'd finished, he drowned half a bottle of whiskey. He took the rope from me and went to the barn to get a ladder. He leaned it against the gnarled lime tree that grew near the house and tied the rope tight around one of its branches. Then he finished the whiskey. I stood under the lime tree and watched as he drunkenly placed his bare feet on each rung. Some of them creaked under him. When he reached the noose, he put it over his head and pulled it tight. I felt strong. My worst enemy had apologized and accepted his just punishment. The devil had saved me. Without him, the rapes would have gone on, leaving me a taciturn, withdrawn girl with no pride and self-confidence. That same day, I ran away from home. All I took with me were the beads. I made bracelets out of them so that I could keep them with me at all times and they could be a constant reminder of my transformation. And also so that my teacher could give me signs through them. I travelled right across Scotland heading west, and he was always with me. He spoke to me and educated me in the mysteries of the human psyche. He demonstrated their power through practical demonstrations. A lot of people died on that journey. All you had to do was say the right words. You know, Mr. Corlin, I've never killed anyone except Anita McCafferty. Except for Anita, I've never physically taken a life. All those people killed themselves, of their own free will, because they wanted to, not because I forced them to. There are bad seeds in everyone's heads that will sprout given the right conditions and the right care. And Kìltem, that was a masterpiece, the final exam to end my studies. I felt like I was conducting an orchestra with the devil's help, making sure all the instruments were in tune, getting to know all the various musicians and sensitively guiding them towards the gears of a machine that would fall apart if just one single part didn't work as it should.
It was the devil's work then.
Yes, Kìltem was. No mortal could create anything so perfect.
And the bad cases from your medical practice?
It was my job by then,
Anita said with pride in her voice. But let's go back to Kìltem. How exactly did you work on the inhabitants with the devil's help?
One by one I got to know them and looked into their souls. I listened to their stories. I shared their traumas and unfulfilled desires.
Did you sleep with them?
That was part of the plan. It was the only way I could convince them that I had full confidence in them. It was the only way I could manipulate them. You see, Mr. Corlin, people are convinced that they control their lives with their minds. But the opposite is true. We act on instinct. Like animals, we use our minds just to rationalize our base actions.
What was the role of the sigil of Baphomet made of split peas in Sophie Gordon's photo?
They weren't peas, they were beads. And the role they played was crucial. Again, it was a sign. Over the course of a year, I built an incredibly complex and interlocking pattern out of individual dominoes. All I needed was a suitable candidate to make the first throw of the dice. In the end, I chose the parish priest. I hated him because he was the most vocally opposed to my presence on the island. I didn't go to mass and confession to appease him, but to get a better look into his soul. I can tell you that I've never seen a man with so many unsatisfied needs and psychological problems in my entire life. He was the perfect candidate. And he had a very close relationship with all the people of Kìltem. He took their confession and knew everything about them. It was a supreme act of manipulation. I managed to convince him that all the people of Kìltem were against him. I extracted several painful memories from his subconscious and activated them. The proof that I had played my part successfully was the fact that I convinced him, the parish priest, to make his move only when he saw a 5-pointed star in a circle as a sign.
Did the devil make it?
No, it was me.
Why didn't you destroy the sigil? How could you have known that no one would notice it?
It was a risk I had to take. I couldn't leave the island after the Kìltem Massacre. The chances of being spotted and remembered in the port of Malig were too great. Harry took me to the mainland that afternoon. I was reassured by the idea that even if someone did notice the sigil of Baphomet later, they wouldn't be able to interpret it correctly. The other shoe I left on the island like Cinderella was a photograph. I remember the day exactly. The annual sheep shearing. I was stupid. It only dawned on me that I shouldn't let myself be photographed after the photographer pressed the shutter. I wanted to destroy the camera, but the bastard kept a close eye on it. Nobody noticed the 2 clues for a full 84 years, until now.
You left 3 clues on Kìltem.
Oh sure, Anita, my alter ego. You already know what happened to her.
Anita, I mean Rebecca.
You can call me by my false name, she grinned. I've got used to it over the years.
Anita then, why have you told me all this? How did you know I didn't have a recording device in my pocket? Anita gazed intently at Jack.
I knew you wouldn't turn me in, even if I confessed to you. I know you better than you know yourself, Jack.
Jack became unsure.
I know that your harmless aversion to mystery and unfinished jobs is not at all as harmless as you tried to tell me last time. That it's making your life hell.
She paused.
And I also know of one desire of yours that could push you to kill.
There is no such thing.
Oh, but there is, Jack, there is. I want you to remember what I'm going to tell you.
Anita fixed Jack with her gaze. Her eyes glowed piercing like 2 coals.
The most important mission of a human being is to accumulate as much wisdom in life as possible. And when he has accumulated it, he should pass it on to his children. And believe me, there's nothing worse than dying alone. Everyone is full of bad seeds, Jack, and they all sprout one day.
You're a senile old bitch, Jack roared. A rotten, disgusting toad. I hope you rot in hell. Anita McCafferty's smile was broad and joyful. From that day, Jack lived happily and contentedly with Ellie on Kìltem. He left the hospice and found a job in the Tourist Information Office. There had been enough death, enough dark stuff. He and Ellie had come to the conclusion that they'd let Anita live out her days in peace. It wasn't worth the stress and energy they'd have to expend on trials and interrogations. They had no desire to avenge the 116 people who died on Kìltem 84 years ago or to reveal the truth about the Kìltem Massacre to the world. It was the past and it should be put to rest. Jack also accepted that he would not have children. He loved Ellie too much to leave her. As promised, they sold one of their houses and moved in together. Month followed month, year followed year. Kìltem was always the same as it had been for thousands of years, except for the crosses. But even those would be swallowed up by the earth in time. One day, Jack learned that Anita McCafferty had died at the age of 102 in her Edinburgh retirement home. That day, he and Ellie celebrated with a whiskey. One evening, Jack set about tidying up. Ellie was enjoying a hot bath in the bathroom. While dusting a cabinet, he accidentally knocked over the decorative vase containing the red stones. He stared at the carpet for a long time, not believing what he was seeing. The sigil of Baphomet! The last words he had heard from Anita McCafferty suddenly flashed through his mind.
The most important mission of a human being is to accumulate as much wisdom in life as possible. And when he has accumulated it, he should pass it on to his children. And believe me, there's nothing worse than dying alone. I know of one desire of yours that could push you to kill. I know you better than you know yourself, Jack. You have to punish the person who hurt you, who didn't give you children. There's nothing worse than dying alone. Everyone's full of bad seeds, Jack, and they all sprout one day.
Jack tore his gaze away from the sigil. He stood up straight and with an absent, puppet-like expression went out to the barn. He had never set foot in it, but he knew he would find it. A pitchfork! He remembered his resolution not to pick up a pitchfork as long as he lived. You should never say never. He grasped the instrument with both hands and eyed the 4 long, narrow, curved tines. They looked sharp. He returned to the house and made his way towards the sound of splashing water. Ellie was still in the bathtub, and the next moment he would open the door.